The first time I remember consciously wanting to wear something that wasn't mine, I was maybe 6 years old. My middle sister, Emma, had a school play, and she came home with a costume, a simple dress with a sash and a paper crown. She left it draped over her bed, and I remember standing in the doorway for what felt like an hour, not moving, just looking at it. It wasn't that I thought it was pretty in the way a child admires a toy. It was something deeper, a pull I couldn't name, as if the dress itself was calling me to try it on so I could see something about myself I hadn't been allowed to see. I didn't touch it that day. I turned around and went back to my room and played with my plastic dinosaurs until dinner. But something inside me had shifted, and I knew, even at 6, that I had a secret now, even if I didn't understand what the secret was. School made things more complicated, because school had rules that were louder than the ones at home. Boys sat on this side, girls on that side. Boys played rough at recess, girls jumped rope by the fence. Boys wore blue, girls wore pink, and even the teachers, who I'm sure meant well, reinforced these divisions in 100 small ways every day. I learned quickly how to perform. I learned how to laugh at the jokes the other boys laughed at, how to talk about cartoons I didn't really watch, how to kick a ball with the right amount of aggression to be counted as one of them without being counted as too much of anything. I was good at it. That's the part one want people to understand. I wasn't a boy who obviously stood out. I wasn't teased for being feminine. I passed. And passing became its own kind of prison because the better I got at it, the more I felt like I was disappearing inside the performance. My father was not a cruel man. I want to say that clearly because it would be easier for a story like this if I could paint him as a villain, and he wasn't. He was a mechanic who worked long hours and came home tired and had been raised by his own father to believe that men were supposed to be a certain way. He loved me. He showed it in the ways he knew how, by teaching me to change the oil in the truck, by taking me to the hardware store on Sunday mornings, by ruffling my hair when I did well on a spelling test. But he had expectations, and those expectations were like a weight I carried without ever being able to set down. He wanted a son who was a certain kind of son, and I wanted to be that for him, more than almost anything, because I loved him, and because I was afraid of what it might mean if I couldn't be. My mother was different. She was a nurse who worked nights at the county hospital, and she had a gentleness that felt like the one soft place in a house full of hard edges. She noticed things. She noticed when I lingered too long looking at her jewelry box. She noticed when I asked, casually, if I could help fold my sister's laundry. She noticed, I think, before I did. But she didn't say anything for years, and I don't blame her for that because I don't think she knew what to say, and I don't think she wanted to name something that might make my life harder than it already had to be. She just watched and she waited, and she loved me the whole time in a way I didn't fully understand until much later. The first time I actually wore something that wasn't mine, I was 9. It was a summer afternoon, and everyone was out of the house. My sisters were at swim practice. My father was at work. My mother had run to the grocery store. I remember standing in the hallway between my bedroom and my sister's room, and I remember the sound of the ceiling fan and the smell of the sunlight coming through the window, and I remember making a decision that felt enormous even though the action was small. I walked into Emma's room. I opened her closet. I took down a pale blue sundress that she had outgrown but hadn't given away yet, and I put it on. It was too big. It hung off my shoulders and pooled around my ankles. And I stood in front of her mirror, and for the first time in my life, I looked at myself and felt something that I can only describe now, all these years later, as recognition. Like I had been looking for someone my whole life and had just found her in a reflection. I only wore it for about 3 minutes. I heard a car pull into the driveway, and panic set in so fast that I ripped the dress off and shoved it back into the closet and ran to my room and pretended to be reading a comic book. It was just the mailman turning around in our driveway, but my heart didn't stop pounding for hours. And that night, lying in bed, I made a promise to myself that I would never do that again. It was the first of many promises I would make and break with myself over the following decade. I want to be honest about that because I think a lot of people who go through something like this imagine it as a straight line, a discovery followed by acceptance followed by transition. It wasn't like that for me. It was a spiral. It was doubling back on myself again and again, promising to stop, doing it again, promising to stop, doing it again, and hating myself a little more each time for the failure of my own willpower. Middle school was the worst of it in some ways. My body started changing in ways I hadn't asked for and didn't want. My voice dropped. Hair began to grow in places I didn't want hair. I looked in the mirror and saw someone becoming a stranger to me, and I couldn't tell anyone because I didn't have the words, and even if I had, I didn't have anyone I trusted enough to say them to. So I started doing what a lot of kids in my position do. I started building a second life inside my own head. I imagined a version of myself that got to grow up differently. I gave her a name. I gave her a wardrobe. I gave her friends and hobbies and a laugh. And I lived inside that daydream during math class and on the bus and while I was supposed to be doing my homework, and it was the only place where I felt truly at rest. I want to pause here and say something important because I know there are young people who might be listening to a story like this and thinking their own private thoughts, and I want them to hear this clearly. I was not broken. I was not sick. I was not doing anything shameful. I was a kid trying to make sense of a self that didn't fit the box the world had built for me, and I was doing it alone because I didn't know I wasn't alone. If you are in that place right now, please know that whatever you are feeling is not a moral failure. It is information about who you are. And information, however uncomfortable, is not an enemy. It is a starting point. That is one of the things I wish someone had told me when I was 12, and since no one did, I'm telling you now. High school brought a different kind of pressure. By then I had learned to bury the part of myself that felt like her so deeply that I could go weeks, sometimes months, without letting her surface. I played on the junior varsity soccer team. I got decent grades. I had a girlfriend for a while, a kind girl named Sarah, who deserved more honesty than I was capable of giving her at the time, and I still think about that sometimes. The way my inability to know myself made me unable to fully love her the way she deserved to be loved. We broke up before junior year, not because of anything dramatic, just because I was drifting, and she could feel it, even if she couldn't name what she was feeling. I hope she found someone who could be fully present with her. I hope she knows I wasn't withholding out of cruelty. I was withholding because I didn't know what I had to give. The internet became my lifeline, and my confessional, and my curse, all at the same time. Somewhere around the age of 15, I started reading. Not looking at pictures, not searching for anything sensational, just reading. I found forums where other people described feelings that sounded so much like mine that I would read them and cry, quietly, alone in my room with the door locked. I found the vocabulary I had been missing my whole life. Words like gender identity. Words like dysphoria. Words like transition. And along with the vocabulary came a new kind of terror because now that I had names for what I was feeling, I couldn't unknow them anymore. I couldn't tell myself it was just a phase or just a curiosity or just a weird private thing that would go away when I got older. I had to decide, eventually, what I was going to do with the truth about myself. And I wasn't ready. I wasn't even close to ready. I went to college 3 states away from home, and I chose it partly because it was far away, and partly because I thought that maybe in a new place where no one knew me, I could figure out who I actually was without the weight of everyone else's expectations. It didn't work quite the way I imagined. I brought myself with me, which meant I brought my fear and my shame and my habit of hiding right along with my dorm room posters and my clothes for the season. But I also met people for the first time in my life who were openly living outside the boxes I had been taught to stay inside. I met a woman in my English literature class who mentioned casually, on the way to grabbing coffee after a lecture, that she was transgender. She said it the way another person might mention that they were from Ohio, or that they were a middle child. Just a fact about her life, offered without shame or spectacle. I don't think she has any idea what that moment did for me. It cracked something open. It showed me that a life could be lived, could be built, could be enjoyed, on the other side of the thing I had been so afraid of my entire life. I still didn't do anything about it, not for a long time. I want to be honest about the slowness of my own progress, because I think stories like mine sometimes get compressed into a montage, and the real experience is much slower and much more full of doubt. What I did in those college years was start experimenting privately. I bought a few things online, cheap things I could hide easily. I would put them on late at night in my dorm room after my roommate had gone home for the weekend, and I would stand in front of the small mirror above my desk, and I would look at myself, and I would feel that same recognition I had felt at 9 years old, and then I would take everything off and hide it at the bottom of a drawer, and promise myself I was done. And then a week later, a month later, I would do it again. The cycle continued. I hated the cycle, but I couldn't stop it because the underlying need wasn't going anywhere just because I willed it to. The turning point for me came in the middle of my junior year, and it wasn't a dramatic moment. It wasn't a revelation on a mountaintop. It was a Tuesday evening in October, and I was walking home from the library through a light rain, and I passed a bookstore, and in the window there was a memoir by a transgender woman about her life. And I stood there in the rain for probably 10 minutes, just staring at the cover, and I realized, with a clarity that surprised me, that I was tired. I was so tired. I was tired of the cycle. I was tired of the promises to myself I couldn't keep. I was tired of the double life I had been living for more than a decade. I was tired of lying by omission to everyone who loved me. And more than anything, I was tired of the exhaustion itself, the sheer daily cost of being a person who is constantly performing. I bought the book. I read it in 2 days. And when I finished it, I sat on my bed for a long time and asked myself a question I had been avoiding my whole life. If I imagine myself at 70 years old, looking back on the life I lived, which version of that life do I want to have lived? Do I want to have spent it hiding, performing, denying, carrying the weight, keeping the secret? Or do I want to have spent it, even imperfectly, even with fear, even with cost, trying to be honest about who I actually am? And when I put the question to myself that plainly, the answer was so obvious, it almost embarrassed me. I had known the answer my whole life. I had just been afraid to say it out loud, even to myself. I didn't come out the next day. I didn't come out the next month. What I did was start writing. I bought a cheap notebook and I started writing to myself, every night, about who I was and what I wanted, and what I was afraid of. I wrote about my father. I wrote about my mother. I wrote about my sisters. I wrote about the girlfriend I had failed to fully love in high school. I wrote about the version of myself I had been imagining since I was 12. And slowly, over months, I began to know myself better than I ever had. I began to understand that the woman inside me was not a fantasy or an intrusion or a phase. She was me. She had always been me. She was the part of me that had been quietly waiting all those years to be allowed into the room. I told my mother first. It was the summer after my junior year, and I had gone home for a week, and we were sitting on the back porch late one night, drinking iced tea, and she asked me, gently, if something was wrong. She had noticed, of course. She had been noticing my whole life. And I opened my mouth to say no, out of habit, and instead I started crying. I cried harder than I had cried since I was a child. And when I could finally speak, I told her everything. I told her about the sundress when I was 9. I told her about the daydreams in middle school. I told her about the notebook. I told her about the woman I had come to understand I was. And my mother, my quiet, gentle mother who had been watching me for 20 years, put her hand on mine and said, I know. I have known for a very long time. And I love you. And we're going to figure this out together. I don't want to pretend that everything was easy after that, because it wasn't. Telling my mother was the beginning of a very long process, not the end of one. My father took much longer. He didn't yell when I finally told him a year later. He didn't throw me out. But he went quiet in a way that hurt more than yelling would have. He needed time. He needed a lot of time. And I had to accept that his timeline was not going to be my timeline, and that his grief, because grief is really what it was, grief for the son he thought he had, was not something I could rush him through. There were months when we barely spoke. There were awkward holidays. There were moments when I was sure I had lost him for good. But he came back, slowly in his own way. He started asking questions. He started using my new name, though it took him almost a year to do it consistently. And one day, about 18 months after I first told him, he called me on a Sunday afternoon and said, I love you. I don't understand everything, but I love you, and I always will. That was the closest we had ever been. And I cried again, because I had spent my whole life afraid of losing him, and here he was, still choosing me. My sisters were easier. Emma, whose sundress I had worn all those years ago, told me she had suspected something since we were kids, and that she was proud of me for finally being able to say it. My older sister, Rachel, Took a little longer to adjust, but she got there, and she has been one of my fiercest advocates ever since. She once told off a stranger in a grocery store who made a comment, and I laughed about it for days because Rachel had always been protective, and it was strange and wonderful to be the one she was protecting, finally, as the sister she now knew I had always been. I want to talk about the practical part of transitioning because I think it's the part that gets either sensationalized or skipped entirely, and neither of those does anyone any favors. It is slow. It is often boring. It involves a lot of paperwork. It involves finding a doctor you trust and having long conversations about what you want and what you don't want, and doing your own research and asking questions and being patient with yourself. It involves telling your employer if you have one and updating your identification documents and figuring out, again and again, what you're comfortable with and what you aren't. There is no single path. There is no correct pace. There is only the path you build for yourself, one step at a time, with the best information you can gather and the most honesty you can muster with your own feelings. For me, the first year was mostly about small things. It was about hearing myself called by my new name and slowly learning to answer to it without hesitation. It was about looking in the mirror and gradually seeing a face I recognized, not the one from the sundress mirror at 9, but a real, adult, present face, one that belonged to me and only me. It was about the small joys I hadn't been prepared for. Buying a coat I actually loved. Getting a haircut that made me cry in the salon chair in a good way. Being called ma'am at a coffee shop by a barista who didn't know me and didn't know my history and just saw the person standing in front of her. I want to say clearly that these joys weren't about performance or aesthetics. They weren't about looking a certain way for other people. They were about the alignment, finally, between the inside and the outside. They were about being able to walk down the street as myself and not have to translate. But I also want to talk about the harder parts, because I don't want anyone to think this was all quiet epiphanies and porch conversations. There were days when I felt like a fraud. There were days when I looked in the mirror and couldn't see her, no matter how hard I tried, and I would sit on the bathroom floor and cry and wonder if I had made a terrible mistake. There were strangers, occasionally, who made comments or who stared or who whispered to their friends when I walked past. There was the loneliness of realizing that some people I had loved my whole life were not going to be able to make the journey with me, and that I would have to let them go, not because I stopped loving them, but because they could not accept the truth of who I was, and staying in relationships that required me to keep hiding was a price I was no longer willing to pay. I lost a friend in the second year. His name was Michael, and we had been close since middle school. He was in my wedding in the life I no longer live. When I told him what was happening, he didn't argue. He didn't get angry. He just went distant. He stopped answering my texts. He stopped calling. And eventually I understood, with a sadness that has never fully gone away, that he was not going to come back. I still think about him sometimes. I still hope, quietly, that he is well. I have made my peace with the fact that some relationships end for reasons that have nothing to do with what you did or didn't do, and that grieving those endings is part of the cost of living an honest life. I would not trade the honesty for the relationship. But I would be lying if I said the loss didn't hurt, because it did, and it still does sometimes, in quiet moments. There is a chapter of this story I don't often tell publicly, and I want to include it here because I think it matters. In the second year of my transition, I got very depressed. I don't mean sad. I mean depressed in the clinical sense, in the sense where getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain, in the sense where I couldn't eat, in the sense where I stopped calling my mother back because I didn't have the energy to sound okay for the length of a phone call. I had assumed, naively, that once I was living as myself, the hard part would be over. And it wasn't. Living as myself was better than not living as myself, in every important way. But it did not erase the years of hiding, the years of shame, the years of accumulated exhaustion. All of that had to come out eventually. And when it did, it hit me harder than anything I had ever felt before. I got help. I want to say that clearly because I think there is sometimes a myth in stories like this that people just tough it out on their own, and I did not tough it out on my own. I found a therapist who specialized in gender identity and who had worked with many people in circumstances similar to mine. I saw her every week for a year, and then every other week for another year, and I still see her occasionally when I feel like I need to check in. I learned, slowly, that mental health is not a destination but a practice, and that being honest about who I am was necessary but not sufficient. I also had to learn how to take care of myself, how to sleep, how to eat, how to move my body, how to build a life around the truth, not just declare the truth and expect the life to build itself. Those lessons took years, and I am still learning them, and I imagine I will be learning them for the rest of my life. I want to say something now about the responsibility I feel toward the people who came before me and the people who will come after. I did not invent the language I used to understand myself. I did not, on my own, build the medical and social infrastructure that allowed me to transition safely and with dignity. Those things were built by people who fought, often at enormous personal cost, so that someone like me, decades later, could look at a bookstore window in the rain and buy a memoir and imagine a different life. I owe those people a debt I can never repay. And the only way I know how to honor that debt is to try, in my own small way, to make the path a little easier for whoever comes next. That is part of why I share the story. Not because my story is special, but because someone, somewhere, is standing where I stood at 15, at 9, at 6, and I want them to know that they are not alone, and that a full and honest and dignified life is possible for them, whatever direction their honesty takes them. I want to be careful here because I know that not everyone who explores questions about their gender identity ultimately chooses a path like mine. Some people find, after exploration, that they are comfortable in the identity they were assigned. Some people find they are somewhere in between, or somewhere entirely outside the binary. Some people find that their exploration was about something else entirely, about creativity or self-expression or working through something they hadn't yet named. All of those outcomes are valid. Exploration is not a commitment. Asking questions is not the same as answering them. What I hope, more than anything, is that people are allowed the space and safety to ask the questions without being punished for asking, and to arrive at their own answers without being pressured toward any particular destination. My story is my story. It is not a template. It is one honest attempt at one life, and I offer it in that spirit, and only in that spirit. There is a moment I want to share from about 5 years into all of this that felt like a kind of closure, though closure is maybe not the right word because I don't think a life like this ever really closes. It just deepens. I was at my niece's birthday party. Emma's daughter, 5 years old, in a princess dress with a tiara that kept slipping. I was helping her cut her cake, and she looked up at me with total seriousness and said, "Annie, are you sad?" And I said, "No, sweetheart. Why do you ask?" And she said, "Because you have tears." And I hadn't even realized I was crying. And I looked around the room at my mother and my father, who was helping my brother-in-law grill in the backyard, and Emma and Rachel, and my niece with her sticky frosting fingers, and I realized that I was crying because I was so completely, unshakably present in my own life for the first time in my memory. I was not performing. I was not translating. I was not carrying a secret. I was just there, an aunt at a birthday party, cutting a cake, being seen and loved as exactly who I was. It was, I think, the most ordinary moment of my life. And that is precisely what made it extraordinary. I want to talk, before I close, about some of the lessons I have taken from all of this, because if I am going to tell a story this long, I owe you more than just the events. I owe you what I have learned. The first thing I have learned is that self-knowledge is not a luxury. It is not selfish. It is not indulgent. It is the foundation on which every other honest thing in your life is built. You cannot love someone else fully if you do not know yourself. You cannot be a good friend, a good child, a good parent, a good citizen if you are hiding from yourself. The work of knowing who you are is the most fundamental work there is, and it is work that continues throughout a life. It does not end at any age. It does not end after any milestone. It is ongoing. The second thing I have learned is that patience with other people is not the same as tolerating harm. My father needed time, and I gave him time because I could tell he was moving toward me, slowly, with genuine effort. My friend Michael needed something I could not give, and I let him go, because staying would have required me to erase myself. Learning the difference between someone who is struggling but growing and someone who is asking you to make yourself smaller for their comfort is one of the most important skills a person can develop. It has nothing to do with gender identity. It has to do with being alive in relationship to other people, and it is a lesson I would have had to learn eventually one way or another. My transition just taught it to me in a particularly intense way. The third thing I have learned is that shame is a liar. Shame told me, from the age of 6, that there was something wrong with me. Shame told me I was disgusting, that I was broken, that if anyone knew the truth, they would recoil. Shame is very persuasive. Shame speaks in the voice of authority. But shame is, in almost every case, wrong. What shame calls disgusting is usually just difference. What shame calls broken is usually just unmet. What shame promises you will experience if you tell the truth, the recoil, the rejection, is usually a fear rather than a reality. Not always. Sometimes people do recoil, as Michael did for me. But even then, the recoil is not evidence that you are wrong, to be honest. It is evidence about the limits of the person recoiling. Learning to hear shame without obeying it is one of the great tasks of a human life. The fourth thing I have learned is that gratitude is not naive. It took me a long time to accept the good things in my life without waiting for them to be taken away. I had spent so much of my early life bracing for punishment that when the punishment didn't come, I didn't know what to do with the peace. I would sabotage it. I would wait for the other shoe to drop. I would refuse to enjoy things fully, because enjoying them felt dangerous. Learning to sit inside a good moment and let it be good, without ruining it in advance, was a skill I had to practice, deliberately, for years. I am still practicing it. When my niece asked me if I was sad because I had tears, I could have deflected. I could have made a joke. Instead, I let myself feel the moment fully, and I let it be as good as it was, and I have thought about it many times since as a kind of touchstone for the person I want to keep becoming. The fifth thing I have learned is that identity is not a costume, and it is not a performance, and it is not a decision made in isolation from the rest of your life. Who I am is not just that I am a woman. It is also that I am a daughter, a sister, an aunt, a friend, a neighbor, a person who does a job, a person who takes out the trash on Tuesdays, a person who has opinions about books and about music and about the best way to make coffee. My gender is real and it matters, and it is a foundational part of my life, but it is not the entirety of my life. I resist the temptation when telling the story to make it the only story about me, because it isn't. It is one chapter. It is a chapter that had to be lived and had to be told, but the book is much longer than that, and I hope, as it continues, that other chapters will get their time in the light too. Finally, and this is the hardest lesson to articulate, I have learned that the people who love you often see you more clearly than you see yourself. My mother saw me before I saw myself. My sister Emma saw me before I saw myself. Even my father, in his slow and painful way, was looking at me and trying to understand, long before I gave him the words. There is a temptation, when you are hiding, to believe that no one else can see the truth, that you are hidden so well that even the people closest to you have been fooled. Usually they haven't been. Usually they are waiting for you to be ready to talk to them about what they have already suspected. That was true in my case, and I have heard it be true in the cases of many other people I have come to know over the years. Trust the people who love you a little more than shame tells you to. They probably already know. They are probably already ready. What they are waiting for is you. I am in my mid-30s now. I live in a small apartment in a city that is not the town where I grew up, but is close enough to visit on weekends. I work as a researcher for a nonprofit, doing work that has nothing to do with gender or transition, work that engages a completely different part of my brain and my heart. I have a partner, a kind and patient woman who knew my whole story before she met me and who chose me anyway, and who I chose back, and with whom I am building a life that is quiet and ordinary and beautiful. I still call my mother every Sunday. My father and I text about baseball. My sisters and I have a group chat that is mostly memes. My niece, now 10, is starting to ask more complicated questions about the world, and I try to answer them honestly, in a way I hope will make her a kind and thoughtful person. This is the life I have. It is not a fantasy. It is not a triumph. It is just a life, an ordinary life, which is what I always wanted, though I could not have known when I was younger that ordinariness was the destination all along. If I could speak to the child I was at 6, standing in the doorway of Emma's room looking at that costume, I would tell him that he's not doing anything wrong by feeling what he feels. I would tell him that he is going to have a long road, and I would not pretend the road is easy, because it isn't, but I would tell him that the road has an end, or at least a resting place, and that the resting place is beautiful. I would tell him that he will be loved. Not by everyone, but by enough people. That his mother will hold his hand when he tells her the truth. That his father will come back to him, in his own time, in his own way. That he will find a life he did not know he was allowed to want. I would tell him to be patient with himself and honest with himself and gentle with the people around him even when they are not always gentle with him. And I would tell him that when he finally gets to the birthday party and the little girl with the sticky fingers asks him why he is crying, it will be one of the best moments of his life, and he should let himself feel every second of it. I did not tell this story to convince anyone of anything. I did not tell it to argue a political point or to speak for a community I do not fully represent. I told it because someone somewhere is standing at a window in the rain, wondering if a life like the one they secretly want is possible, and I wanted to say from wherever I am standing now that it is. I told it because for a very long time I would have given anything to hear a story like this, and if I have the chance to offer that to someone else, it feels like the least I can do. I told it because honesty is a practice, and each time I tell it, I get a little better at it and a little more comfortable with the fact of my own life, and a little more capable of showing up for the lives of others. Stories are how we teach each other how to be alive. I hope this one, imperfect and specific and only mine, teaches something useful to at least one person listening. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.